"It hurts being without a man," the giant Apache girl said, the shy farmer vertical bar. Best Wild West stories. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky a deep orange as the dust swirled through the air on the open plains. Thomas stood on his small farm, wiping the sweat from his brow. The land was dry, but it had always been his. He wasn't much of a talker, and the small frontier town nearby had never offered him the company he sought. His life was simple, just him and his farm. He was used to being alone. Ever since his father passed away, Thomas had taken up the reins of the farm. He could tend to the crops, fix the fences, and care for the cattle, but there was always a quiet loneliness in his heart. He had friends in town, but no one close enough to call a true companion. Most of the time it didn't bother him, but there were days when the silence felt heavier than usual. That evening, as the last of the daylight slipped away, Thomas noticed something strange. A figure, tall and imposing, was making its way toward his farm. At first he thought it was just another traveler passing by, but then he saw her, an Apache woman, large and strong, with broad shoulders and a confident stride. She was carrying something heavy on her back, wrapped in a blanket. Her presence was powerful, like the mountains that loomed in the distance. Thomas felt a pang of uncertainty. He wasn't used to strangers, especially not ones like her. He wiped his hands on his worn pants and watched as the woman drew closer. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, nor did she seem afraid. Her eyes, dark and piercing, met his gaze without hesitation. "Evening," Thomas said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman stopped in front of him and gave a small nod. Her face was serious, but not unfriendly. "Evening," she replied in a deep, steady voice. "I am Tala." The name seemed to fit her well. It carried weight, strength, and mystery, much like her presence. "I'm Thomas," he said, nervously brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Can I help you with something?" Tala stood for a moment, sizing him up. Her eyes flicked over the farm before returning to him. "I am traveling. I need a place to rest for the night. The road is long, and I've no place to go." Thomas hesitated. His instincts told him to offer her shelter, but he wasn't sure what he was dealing with. He knew little of the Apache people, except what he'd heard in town. Stories that painted them as fierce warriors, wild and untamable, but Tala's presence didn't feel threatening. It felt lonely, like someone who, despite their strength, needed a place to rest, to belong. "Of course," Thomas said after a long pause. "You can stay in the barn. It's not much, but it's dry." Tala nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude. "Thank you." As she followed him to the barn, Thomas couldn't help but notice how tall she was. She stood nearly a foot above him, and her broad shoulders were a stark contrast to his own thin frame. Yet, despite her imposing stature, there was something vulnerable about her. The way she moved, the way she looked around as if she were searching for something. Once inside the barn, Tala set down her bundle and surveyed the space. It was modest, straw on the floor for bedding, a few old crates stacked in the corner, and the faint smell of hay in the air. "This will do," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Thank you." Thomas, unsure of what to say, nodded and began to turn to leave. He didn't know how to continue the conversation, or if there even was a conversation to have. But then Tala's voice stopped him. "Do you mind if I ask you something, Thomas?" He turned back to face her. Sure. What is it?" Tala paused for a moment, her dark eyes studying him. "How long have you been alone here?" Thomas blinked in surprise. It wasn't something people usually asked. He shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, since my father passed, it's just been me and the land." She nodded slowly. "I know what it's like to be alone." Her words hung in the air, and Thomas could feel the weight of them. He knew what it was like to be alone, but something in her voice made him realize that her solitude went deeper than his. She wasn't just alone in the sense that she had no one to talk to. She was alone in a way that spoke of loss and displacement. "I suppose it's easier out here, away from people," Thomas said, though he didn't fully believe it. Tala's gaze softened, and she took a step closer. "It isn't easy, not really. There's something painful about being alone. It eats at you slowly." Thomas shifted uneasily, not sure how to respond. "I don't know if I've ever really been lonely," he said quietly. "I mean, there's always work to do. But I suppose sometimes when the sun sets and the day is done, it does feel like there's something missing." Tala didn't speak for a moment, her eyes fixed on the ground as if she were thinking deeply. "I didn't ask for this," she said finally, her voice low. I didn't ask to be alone, but here I am. Thomas couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She wasn't just a woman of strength and power. She was a person who had been shaped by her circumstances, just like he had. She wasn't so different from him after all. Well, you can stay here for the night at least, Thomas said, his voice softening. It's not much, but it's safe. Tala nodded again, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Thomas. I may be bigger than you, stronger even, but I am still human. I still need to rest. Thomas felt a strange sense of relief. There was something about this woman, her size, her strength, that had made him feel small, insignificant. But now, standing there in the dim light of the barn, he saw her differently. She wasn't just an outsider, someone to be feared. She was just like him. She needed peace, a break from the harshness of the world. Well, get some rest, Thomas said, turning to leave. I'll make some coffee in the morning if you'd like. Coffee sounds good, Tala said, her voice softening just a bit. As Thomas stepped out of the barn, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a chance meeting. There was something in the way Tala spoke, in the way she looked at him, that made him realize they were both searching for something. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe he had found a piece of what he was looking for. The days passed slowly at first, with Tala adjusting to the rhythms of farm life. She helped Thomas with the crops, lifting heavy bags of seed and hauling water from the well. Her strength amazed him, but it wasn't just her size that stood out. It was her quiet, steady nature. Every day Thomas found himself watching her work, fascinated by how effortlessly she moved, despite the weight of the task. At first their conversations were brief, filled with polite exchanges and quiet acknowledgments. But over time, as the days grew longer and the work became more familiar, their silence began to break. Tala started sharing more about herself, small details about her past, her tribe, and the life she had left behind. It wasn't much, but it was more than Thomas had expected. I used to have a family, she said one evening as they worked together to repair a fence. A mother, a father, brothers, but they're gone now. The raids took them. Thomas glanced over at her, surprised by the sadness in her voice. He had always known there was something about her, something that spoke of loss, but he hadn't dared to ask. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That's terrible. Tala gave a small shrug, her eyes focused on the task at hand. It's the way of things. The world isn't always kind. But I survived. I've had to. Thomas didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine the pain she must have felt, losing everything in one sweep. He had lost his father, but that was nothing compared to what she had endured. Still, he couldn't help but feel a tug in his chest, a desire to help her, to ease some of her pain. You're not alone anymore, he said after a long silence. Not here. You have a place with me. Tala looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for a moment. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something soft, something human. Thank you, she said softly. I didn't expect kindness from anyone, let alone someone like you. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply smiled and continued working, the weight of her words lingering in the air between them. The next few days were spent in the same quiet routine. They worked together, shared simple meals, and talked about their lives. Thomas learned that Tala's people had lived in the mountains, fierce warriors who had once been proud and strong. But that was all in the past now. She spoke of the land she had known, of the traditions that had shaped her, and of the family she had loved and lost. As much as Tala shared, though, she kept some things to herself. Thomas never pushed. He didn't want to force her to speak about things she wasn't ready to discuss, but he couldn't help but notice the quiet pain that seemed to follow her every move, as if the weight of her past was always pressing down on her, even when she smiled. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire in the small clearing outside the barn. The night was calm, the stars bright above them. Tala was silent, her gaze fixed on the flames, while Thomas poked at the fire with a stick. I've never had anyone to talk to like this, Thomas said after a long while. I mean, I've spoken to people in town, but it's never been like this. I don't know how to explain it. Tala glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. What do you mean? It's like you understand things without me having to say much? Thomas said, his voice low. I feel like you don't judge me. You just accept me. I've never had that before. Tala studied him for a long moment, her eyes soft in the firelight. I understand, she said quietly. I've never had anyone to talk to either. People, they fear me. They see my size, my strength, and they think I'm something else. Something dangerous. "You're not dangerous," Thomas said, shaking his head. "I see you, Tala. Not just the strength, but the person you are." She didn't respond right away, but Thomas could see the way her shoulders relaxed, just a little, as if his words had given her permission to let go of something heavy, even if only for a moment. "Thank you, Thomas," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've never felt at ease with anyone before." Thomas smiled, feeling something inside him shift. It wasn't just her strength that made her remarkable. It was her heart, her ability to carry so much pain without letting it break her. And here she was, sitting beside him, sharing her burdens, letting him see the real her. For the first time in his life, Thomas didn't feel like the outsider. With Tala, he wasn't alone. The next few weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. The bond between them grew, not through grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but through simple moments of understanding. They learned to work together in harmony, each complementing the other. Tala's strength helped Thomas with tasks that would have otherwise been impossible, while Thomas's gentle nature offered her a quiet refuge from the chaos of her past. Despite their growing friendship, there was still an unspoken tension between them, a feeling neither of them knew how to address. Every time they worked together, there was a certain closeness, a subtle connection that neither could ignore. Thomas found himself stealing glances at Tala, his heart beating faster whenever their hands brushed or their eyes met for too long. He didn't understand it, didn't know what to do with it. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire again, just as they had so many times before. The night air was cool, and the crackling of the fire filled the silence between them. Tala seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. "I didn't expect any of this," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect to find a place like this, a place where I could feel safe." Thomas didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, his heart swelling with emotions he couldn't quite name. "You've always had a place here," he said softly. "I don't care where you came from. I care about who you are now." Tala turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The firelight danced in her dark eyes, and Thomas felt something shift within him, a feeling he couldn't deny. I think I'm starting to believe that," she whispered. The days had started to grow warmer, and with each passing day, Thomas and Tala's bond grew stronger. They had become a quiet team, working together seamlessly. Tala's strength was unmatched, and Thomas had learned to rely on her in ways he never thought possible. There were mornings when he would wake up to see her already working, lifting barrels and fixing fences, her presence both commanding and peaceful. The two had begun to share more than just the workload. Their conversations had turned into something deeper, something more personal. Tala spoke of her lost family with an almost haunting calmness. Sometimes she would recount stories of her childhood, her life among the Apache people, and the rich traditions she had been raised with. For Thomas, those stories were a window into a world he had never known, a world full of strength, pride, and loss. And as the days stretched on, he began to understand Tala's silence better. It wasn't just her size or strength that set her apart. It was her history, her life lived in the shadows of war and survival. But now, here on this small farm, she was starting to find peace. Or so it seemed. But peace, like everything else, was fleeting. It started one afternoon with the sudden arrival of dust clouds in the distance. At first, Thomas thought it was just a strong wind. But as the dust got closer, he realized that something was off. It wasn't just the wind. It was the unmistakable sign of riders. A group of them, coming fast, kicking up the earth beneath them as they sped toward the farm. Tala was in the barn, mending a broken fence post. Thomas stood at the edge of the yard, watching the riders approach, his heart racing. He could see the way they moved. Each one seemed to have a purpose, as if they were searching for something. "Tala!" he shouted, his voice tight with fear. "We've got company!" She appeared at the barn door in an instant, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The riders were drawing closer. There were 5 of them, all mounted on powerful horses. They wore worn-out clothes, and their faces were covered with dust, but the way they moved made it clear that they were not ordinary travelers. "Get inside," Tala barked, her voice low and commanding. She didn't wait for Thomas to reply. In one fluid motion, she reached for the rifle leaning against the barn wall and rushed toward the front of the house. "Stay low and don't make a sound," she said as she moved. Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the fear in Tala's eyes was enough to make him obey. He quickly ducked into the house, peering out through the small window. The riders were almost at the fence now, and he could feel the tension in the air. Something about them felt wrong, dangerous even. Tala's presence was still a calming force, but even she knew there were dangers in this world she couldn't control. The leader of the riders, a tall, broad man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted first. His eyes immediately scanned the land, locking onto the barn where Tala stood. He had a look of someone who had been hunting for a long time, and he was finally about to catch his prey. "You!" he shouted, pointing directly at Tala. His voice was gruff, his tone commanding. "We're here for you." Tala didn't flinch. She stood tall, the rifle held loosely at her side. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with warning. The man grinned, showing his yellowed teeth. "You're a strong one, aren't you? We've been hearing stories about you. The mighty Apache warrior, lost and alone. You've been causing a lot of trouble for our men. It's time you came with us." Tala's expression hardened. Thomas watched from inside the house, his heart in his throat. He didn't understand fully what was happening, but the way the men spoke, the way they looked at her, made it clear that they weren't here for peace. "I don't think so," Tala replied simply, her voice low. The man laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made Thomas's stomach twist. "You don't get to decide. You're coming with us, whether you like it or not." He motioned to the others, who were already dismounting, their hands hovering over their weapons. Thomas didn't know what to do. He had always been someone who avoided conflict, preferring the quiet solitude of his farm over the violence of the outside world. But this was different. They were here for Tala, and he couldn't let them take her. She had become more than just a guest. She was a friend, someone who had shown him kindness and trust when no one else had. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed the rifle that Tala had left behind and rushed outside, his pulse racing. Tala saw him coming and immediately moved to block the path of the riders. "Get back inside," she commanded, her voice sharp. But Thomas wasn't listening. His hands shook, but he held the rifle tightly, determined. "I won't let you take her," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He didn't know what he was doing, but the words had left his mouth before he could stop them. The leader of the riders raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do about it, farmer?" he sneered, eyeing Thomas's rifle. "You think you can stop us?" Tala stepped forward, her massive form towering over Thomas. "He's with me," she said firmly, looking the leader straight in the eye. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll leave now." For a moment, the men seemed to hesitate. They weren't used to being challenged, especially by someone like Tala. But their hesitation didn't last long. The leader gave the signal, and before Thomas could react, the other riders began to move toward him. Everything happened in an instant. The leader lunged toward him, knocking the rifle from his hands. But Tala was faster. In one swift motion, she drew her own weapon, aiming it directly at the leader. "Leave!" she commanded, her voice like thunder. "Now!" The riders froze, eyes wide. They had underestimated her, underestimated the strength that lay beneath her calm exterior. "You've been warned," Tala said, her tone ice cold. "Leave, or I'll make you regret it." For a long moment, there was no sound except for the wind and the soft crackling of the fire. The riders exchanged uncertain glances. Then slowly, the leader raised his hand and gestured for his men to mount their horses. "We're not finished with you yet," he spat, before turning away and riding off with the others. As they disappeared into the distance, Thomas stood there, shaking. His heart still raced in his chest. He had been so close to losing everything. Tala stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon to ensure they were really gone. When she was sure the threat had passed, she turned to him. "Are you all right?" Thomas nodded, though he didn't feel all right. This body was still trembling, and the adrenaline hadn't worn off. I didn't know what to do." "You did what you had to do," Tala said softly, "and I'm grateful." He looked at her, seeing her not just as a woman of strength, but as someone who had come to mean so much to him. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Tala's gaze softened, and for a moment the world seemed still. They stood there, side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days following the encounter with the riders were filled with a new tension. Thomas had never imagined that his quiet farm would attract such trouble, but now he understood how dangerous Tala's past could be. Despite the danger passing, he could still feel the weight of the threat hanging over them. Tala had reassured him that she had faced worse before, but he couldn't shake the worry. He had grown attached to her, more than he had ever expected. She was no longer just the mysterious woman who had come to his farm for shelter. Tala had become a part of his life. He had watched her work tirelessly, shared meals with her, and even opened up to her in ways he never thought possible. In many ways, she had become his protector, just as much as he had become hers. The threat had passed, but the memory of those men lingered in the back of Thomas's mind. He couldn't shake the fear that they would return, or that worse trouble would come. He glanced over at Tala as she worked, her strength so evident in everything she did. He admired her courage, her resilience, but beneath that strength, he saw the weariness in her eyes, the toll that living a life of constant danger had taken on her. One evening after a long day of work, the two sat together by the fire. The air was cooler than usual, and the stars above twinkled brightly like the countless possibilities that stretched out before them. "I've been thinking," Thomas began, his voice quiet, "about what you said. The part about feeling, I think I understand now. I don't know what it's like to lose everything like you have, but I do know what it feels like to be isolated." Tala turned her head to face him, her eyes soft in the firelight. "I don't want to be a burden to you, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle. "I know that I'm different from you. I know I'm not from this land, and I know that one day I might have to leave. But right now, I'm grateful for what we have." Thomas felt a pang in his chest at her words. He didn't want her to leave. He hadn't said it aloud, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. "You don't have to leave," he said firmly, his voice low but certain. "You have a place here." "You don't have to be alone anymore, Tala." Tala looked at him for a long time, as if weighing his words carefully. "I don't know what the future holds, Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I do know that I'm not as alone as I once was. You've shown me kindness, and that's something I never thought I'd find again." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on their faces. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them standing on the edge of something neither fully understood, but both felt deeply. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked, his voice uncertain. He had never been one for big decisions, never one to chart a clear path forward. But with Tala by his side, he realized that he didn't need all the answers. Tala smiled softly, her gaze turning to the horizon where the land stretched out in all directions. "We keep going," she said simply. "We take things one day at a time. We work together. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find something more than just survival." Thomas nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. He didn't need to have everything figured out. What mattered was that they were together. And for the first time in his life, Thomas didn't feel the loneliness that had always haunted him. There was a future waiting for them, one that was built on trust and mutual respect. The next few weeks were peaceful, though the shadow of the riders still loomed in the back of their minds. Tala continued to help Thomas with the farm, her strength making the hard work seem effortless. And as they worked side by side, their connection grew. They learned more about each other, not just through their words, but through their actions. Every glance, every touch, spoke volumes that words couldn't capture. Thomas found himself smiling more, laughing more. He hadn't realized how much joy he had been missing until Tala came into his life. And Tala, for the first time in a long while, felt like she had a place to belong, a place where she could finally let down her guard and be herself. One evening, as they sat together by the fire once again, Tala looked at him thoughtfully. "Thomas, I've been thinking."
"You said I don't have to leave."
"But what if one day I have to? What if the men who came before return? Or worse, what if my past catches up with me?" Thomas shook his head, reaching over to take her hand. "I won't let them take you," he said firmly. "We'll face whatever comes, together. I don't care what your past is or where you came from. What matters is who you are now, and I'm not letting you go." Tala's heart swelled at his words. She had never had anyone fight for her, never had anyone promise to stand by her through whatever came. For the first time, she felt truly safe. Not just because of her strength, but because Thomas had made a promise she didn't take lightly. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm home." The silence between them was comfortable, filled with a sense of shared understanding. They didn't need to speak anymore to know how they both felt. Everything had changed. They had changed. In the days that followed, they continued to build a life together. The farm flourished with Tala's help, and their bond deepened. Despite the lingering threat of the riders, they both found solace in their work and in each other. Tala had become more than just a companion. She had become his equal, his partner in everything. And for the first time, Thomas realized that this was what he had always been searching for. A life built not on solitude, but on connection. A life where he wasn't alone, where the weight of the world didn't fall solely on his shoulders. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas and Tala's bond only grew stronger. They faced challenges, yes, but together they overcame them. There was nothing they couldn't do when they worked side by side. One day, as they stood together on the hill overlooking the farm, Thomas took a deep breath and turned to Tala. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to face it without you." Tala smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made Thomas's heart swell. "You won't have to," she replied. "Not ever again." And with that promise, the future no longer seemed so uncertain. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with strength, love, and a bond that nothing could break.